Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to some of the new faces I've seen before, but as I mentioned a number of times, according to Jewish mysticism, existence is renewed every moment. So even though our lives may get boring and monotonous, beneath the surface, which physics today confirms, is pulsating, renewable, perpetually rejuvenated energy every moment. Now, if you could tap into that, of course, that would be the secret to all of life, because how much trouble do we get into, and how many mistakes do we make because we're looking for some high, some excitement. And if one is able to tap into the reservoirs of energy that are constantly being renewed every given moment, it would resolve many of our issues of looking for outside stimulation, distractions, whatever it is that we think gives us some type of momentary high, a sugar temporary high. So that's just an aside. That's not the topic of the evening, but I just said it because whenever I say seeing new faces, seeing faces I've seen, the truth is every face is new all the moment. And I was once speaking to a photographer. He was a world-class photographer. He was Russian-born. And I met him, and his specialty was motion photography. You know, capturing, for example, ice skaters or speed runners, people in very fast motion, which of course requires a particular skill, because you're trying to capture someone in motion. At the same time, you don't want a whiz. You want to see an actual stationary picture. At the same time, capturing them in motion. So it requires a particular interesting art. And we're speaking about it, and you know, the classic line from Picasso, the artist who said that art is the biggest lie that reveals a deeper truth. Because no piece of art is real. Everything in life is mobile, everything is moving. So any type of stationary picture, what we call a still shot, is actually not real, because nothing is still. And yet, a good artist and a good photographer could capture, in a still moment, they can capture an entire passion, an entire sentiment. So he was telling me that when he photographed different people, he says sometimes you photograph, this is the way he put it. He was Russian and he had put everything he was very blunt. So he said, there are people that you see the face of death, and there's some people with the face of life. And he didn't mean death as in dead people. He said people who are alive, but their picture always looks the same. They're plastic. Nothing changes. Because they've developed they've mastered the art of falsifying and deceptive and duplicity, that they put on a face which is really a mask. He says, as a photographer, you can immediately see it. And then there are people, when you see their face, every time you take a picture of them, there'll be a different pose because they're alive. So their eyes sparkle a different way, their cheeks are different, their complexion, their disposition, and so on. And then there are people, you take a picture, every time it looks the same. He says, because these are people who are living, what he called the living dead. Their faces and their lives are dead. And he doesn't even know who the person is, but he can immediately, when he takes a picture, know what type of person that is. False people versus real people. So it's an interesting way of looking at it, because life is actually an expression from Maimonides in the Guide of the Perplexed. In the Moreh Nevuchim, he says, Kol chai misnaneya. Anything that's alive is always on the move. You know, today it takes on a new interpretation, because we have the world of the mobility, mobile phones. You're on the move, you know. But the truth is, anyone that was, you don't need modern technology to be a person who's alive. And frankly, there are people who never had technology and they were as alive as it gets, and there are people who have all the technology in the world and they're as dead as it gets. Just like we say that somebody can clock and have billions of miles, of frequent flyer miles, and have never moved an inch spiritually or emotionally. And there are people who have never moved, who have never physically necessarily moved, but they're alive and they're traveling millions of miles. So this is really, part of the world in which we live, as I said, duplicitous world, echad b'peh echad b'lev world, where you have the duplicity between one thing, you can say one thing and mean another. You can smile to somebody and then stab them in the back. You know, this is the art of duplicity that this world, adults of course master. Children have not yet learned that trick, for good reasons, because children, what you see is what you get. It's called seamlessness. In the words of our liturgy, of Jewish liturgy, it's Hashem echad, echad. It's unity, there's oneness, a seamlessness, that we all are touched by. When you see someone, what you see, what you get, their inside, teiche kibari, their inside is like their outside, and their outside is like their inside. Something about it that resonates with us. Because it's called truth. But, we've gotten accustomed to a lot of falsity, so some of us think that false is the default and truth is the novelty. Children don't know that yet, and hopefully we as adults don't teach that to them too early. Keep them, I wouldn't say naive, but keep them honest. And honesty means that there's no two worlds, there's no dichotomy. There's no dissonance in the psychological terms. Dissonance, cognitive dissonance, emotional dissonance, and all the different things, which maybe it explains why, even though it's almost like the opposite reason, many of us understand that when a boy becomes bar mitzvah, that's when they begin to be mechuyev, responsible to put on tefillin. So tefillin is the mitzvah, the phylacteries that we put on at age 13. Some people begin 2 months earlier to train, whatever the different customs. For a girl, it's a bas mitzvah, so it's not through tefillin, it's through own maturity. But what is the main reason we say about tefillin? We say that tefillin is because at that point, the person is beginning to enter maturity. They're not yet fully mature, but they begin to be, you could expect from them self-control. And putting on tefillin is a sacred act, where a child may not be able to control themselves and therefore provide the proper sanctity to putting on tefillin. An adult, meaning a bardas, a person who turns 13, is beginning to be responsible for their behavior. Until that point, their parents are responsible for their behavior. So therefore now they are turning into a gadol b'dayat, meaning they become mature to the point that they can begin to put on tefillin. But if you want to think about it, you could also explain it the other way around. What does tefillin do? Tefillin is, because of course the obvious question you could ask, why would you deprive anybody from such an important mitzvah? If it's a beautiful mitzvah, why would you deprive children from it? Find a way that you can do it, do the equivalent and so on. So the reason is because tefillin comes to accomplish what's called shibud halev hamoyach. Shibud halev hamoyach means the binding of the mind to the heart. Why? Because our minds and our hearts are most often in different places. And just look at yourself on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis or momentary basis. Your heart tells you one thing, and your mind tells you, no, that's not good. And you usually still do it, even while you have that conflict, because the emotions and the mind are usually more powerful than the mind. The emotions are usually more powerful than the intellect. Like he says in Tanya, chapter 9, when he explains the battle between the two sides, the two voices in each of us. So the emotions reside in the heart, and the mind, and which is the animal soul, as he puts it, the impulsive, which is emotionals are impulse, and the divine soul rests and resides in the mind, which is reflective. And there's a battle. So just as the blood of the heart travels to the brain and sustains it, so too the emotions travel to the mind and affect it. What is that called? It's called bias, prejudice. That when we're biased, when we're emotionally invested in something, your mind gets distorted. And the Torah calls the person chachamim. It blinds the eyes of the wise. The Torah Semes, true Torah, calls somebody wise. It means they're truly wise. So how could a truly wise person be biased? That's the power of emotions. And no one should ever underestimate. There's no person on earth, even Moses, the great Moses, had to recuse himself in situations, which was of course his greatness, that he didn't have to be told to recuse himself. Because if there's even one tinge of possibility that your emotions are affecting your mind, you can't be trusted. There's bias. And the worst bias is the ones you don't even see. Ones you acknowledge is one thing, but the prejudices we don't see. And we all have prejudices. It's called prejudice, bias, stereotypes. The list goes on. So even if Einei Chachamim, even Divrei Tzadikim, even if someone's wise, and even if someone's righteous, when it comes to the emotions, just like the blood affects the mind, the brain, emotions affect the mind. And therefore we have this conflict all day, all the time, between what your emotions tell you and what your mind tells you. So tefillin comes to counter the balance. Shibud halev hamoyach. You put tefillin on the left arm if you're righty, across your heart, and on the head, and it's a form of binding, and you bind it. So what does it signify? It signifies is the reunification, the reintegration. Let's put it this way: the battling all forms of cognitive and emotional dissonance, to put it in more sophisticated terms. Now, children don't have this dissonance, so they don't need tefillin. Even though, as I said, most people see tefillin as being the gift of for the mature, in truth, is children don't have this dissonance. They are initially in that place where their mind and emotions are one. That's why parents have to tell them, don't tell everybody what you see, because children don't know the art of lying. They have not mastered that. They don't even know what it means. Like if someone were to ask you, when's the first time you ever lied? You probably don't remember, because when the transition from losing your innocence is part of the fact that you don't remember how it was like before you ate from the tree of knowledge, basically, in your own personal life. So the first time you lie is usually you saw someone else lie, a friend, most likely your parents. So we learn how to lie from the adults around us because they know the dissonance. So in an interesting way, tefillin is necessary for those that need that binding. So that's an aside as a small introduction to this discussion here. As I said, this is not what I wanted to begin discussing. Is the theme of this class is the slavery of our times. And of course, it's all connected to what I just said, because emotions, even as for all their virtues and all their beauty, can also enslave us in their tentacles as they entrap us in their biased and prejudiced view of things. And to the point that they even cloud our mind and our judgment. And once they cloud our judgment, we lose sense of objectivity, which is going to be part of the discussion here. So the slavery of our times. Now, With that said, the going back to what I said at the outset, that in Judaism it teaches us how the seamlessness and the unity of existence, which for children comes naturally. I was going to add one more point about that. In Hebrew, the word for face is panim. In English, when you say the face of something, on the face of it you say, right? You mean on the surface. On the face of it, it looks like one way. But when you dig deeper, like ostensibly, it's one way, but then when you dig deeper, you realize it's not that way. That's a common expression. In Hebrew, the word panim doesn't just mean face. It also means panim, inside. Panimiyut, which is interesting. The word in English, face, does not mean necessarily inside. It could reflect what's on inside, but not necessarily. Something could be on the surface one way, as I just was describing, and within maybe something else altogether. In Hebrew, the word for face is also panim and panim, which means, again, teiche kibari, the inside and the outside are similar. You see on the face, you see in the outer expression what's going on within, and what's within is being expressed to the outside. That is, as I mentioned, is essentially the concept of integration. You'll see people who have that ability are people who are happy people, because they don't have to be covering their tracks all the time with lies and deception. And we all know every lie has to lead to another lie to cover up for the first lie, etc. And when I say lying, I don't necessarily mean it in the most childish, blatant way. Lying is, there's white lies, there's the whole life where you live a life, what you see is not what you get. Now, obviously, I have to qualify. That doesn't mean that everything that's what they say by a drunk, you say, was is often lung is often sung in Hebrew, in Yiddish. In English, that means that by a drunk, whatever's on his lung is on his tongue. It's a Yiddish expression, which means whatever is inside, he says on the outside. Obviously, I'm not referring to a fool who just expresses everything they feel. That's not my point here. My point is that there is no duplicity. There's no deceptiveness. There's no deception. There is a certain seamlessness. You talk to someone, you have the eye contact, you have the honesty, you know you're talking to someone you can trust. You know, how many people do we trust in this world? Now, of course, if you don't trust yourself, obviously it's going to be hard to trust others. And you always project. You say, you know what, I can't be trustworthy, so how could that person be trustworthy? Which, of course, is yet another part of how our emotional perspective on things clouds our judgment, because we project. We project what we think we're not capable of, we think no one is capable of. Which, of course, is one of the big fallacies that really does not allow a person to grow. Because then you're basically writing your own death warrant and saying, since I can't do it, it means no one can do it. Which essentially is really an insecure person's way of justifying your position, because you think, no, it can't be possible. It's not possible. It's not possible. Why? Because you have not seen it in your life. Now, any intelligent person knows what is intelligence if not broadening your horizons and learning things you haven't seen. That's the whole point of intelligence. If you try to fit everything into existing frameworks, how can you grow? And this, frankly, is one of the most challenging issues, especially when it comes to psychological issues, because when it comes to intellectual issues, many of us can say, okay, I could hear a new idea. But when it comes to your own personal emotional attitudes, very, very hard to suddenly try something new or something different. Because that's exactly what emotions are. Like the guy that tells his friend, the guy that says I've asked this a number of times, you have any blind spots? He says, yes, but I know what they are. Like the doctor that tells you, I'll tell you when you need a second opinion. That's the whole point of going to a second doctor. Not because you'll tell me, I don't want to hear from you. I heard your opinion. I want to hear someone else's opinion, not you'll tell me when I need a second opinion. But these are part of the games people play to cover up their own fears and insecurities and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is our introduction to the topic, as I said, slavery of our times. Now, obviously, it's for many of us, that's an oxymoron, because our times are not defined by slavery. Slavery we associate with, for Jews especially, back to the Egyptian bondage, which we honor and celebrate on Passover, and we remember every day, Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, we remember the exodus from Egypt. For the black community, it's the slavery, the American slavery that they were subject to, the beginning of this founding of this country. And slavery, that's how most of us define. Most of us see slavery as something of the past, abolished mostly, especially in the Western world, right? And there may be some forms of slavery in certain African countries. But as far as the so-called art world, most people say we live in the free world, right? How often do you see the free world? How many articles? It comes to the point we don't even think about free world. We're in a free world. And there's also strong argument for that because, especially if you know your history, it's only 300 years old that institutionalized freedom has been established. It's not even a long time. 3 centuries, that's all it is. Where the Declaration of Independence of the United States, the first of, not the first, there was the Magna Carta, there's the Bill of Rights and so on, but the first established government that declared in writing that every human being has inalienable rights endowed to us by the Creator, which includes the freedom of expression and the freedom for the pursuit of happiness, and then followed up in the First Amendment of this country's Constitution, and that is the freedom of religion and freedom of expression and speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of press. These are freedoms set in stone, which is very admirable because for thousands of years this was simply unacceptable. It was not simply non-existent. The monarchs, the church leaders, the religious authorities ruled. Some of them happened to be benevolent, the minority, but some of them happened to, so we were lucky. But most were not. Bottom line is we were subject to someone else's rules who imposed it upon us, meaning us, the nations of the world. And that was what history was about. This changed 3 centuries ago from an institutional level. There must have been thinkers and writers that believed in it. Jews, from the outset, if you read the Bible, well, you got to read right in the beginning. Every human being is created in the divine image, which essentially is really where the founding fathers took that statement from the Declaration of Independence. If you know their writings and their correspondence, you see they basically took it straight out of the biblical thought, because endowed to us by the Creator. That's what they write in the Declaration of Independence. The same documents, the same government that guarantees the separation of church and state is using the word Creator. And though there have been some detractors who've tried to change that, but no one's going to change that. That's part and parcel of this country, the Creator. The only country in the world that also has on its money, on its currency, in God we trust. I know it's become so common, but it's pretty amazing that it should have those words. I understand that doesn't mean that everything in this country is godly and divine. That's not my point. My point, however, is that these are statements because the founding fathers were deists. They weren't particularly religious, but they were smart enough to understand that if it's not coming from the Creator, because they could have easily written that all people are born equal. All people are equal. All men, they say. All men are. Why do they have all men are created equal? And they use the word Creator, which is clearly a divine, a deity. They could have easily avoided that because they understood that as long as it's not attributed to some form of force that's greater than all of us, anyone can come and say, you know what? Some of us are more equal than others. If we're born equal, we could determine some of us are not born equal. Once it's endowed to us by a force that is not man-made, that guarantees absolute freedom, which is interesting. I don't know if anybody's pointed it out, but I'm sure the irony has not been lost on us that it was people who believed in a Creator that guaranteed freedom even to atheists. Would atheists have guaranteed the same freedom to believers, is the question. Because they could say, you know what, we can't use a Creator. If you can't use a Creator, you're immediately opening up the Pandora's box, so who says we're all equal? So they understood that, and no one's ever challenged it to the point, obviously, of reversing it. Even the Atheist Association of America, whatever they're called, because there is a logic to it. And it's not necessarily a religious argument, it's a logical argument. That once you take away that absolute element of a creator, now that's an aside, but the point I wanted to make was the issue of freedom. So you have a country like ours, and today you have most of the countries of the world embrace more or less these principles. We Jews acutely are aware of this because we have benefited from this. If anyone suffered before 300 years ago, it was us. So these rules of laws, if anyone benefited, it was no one that the Jews benefited more than anyone, because they were completely discriminated for thousands of years as Christ killers. The Christian majority of the Western world discriminated against Jews. Not just discriminated is a mild word. Persecuted, expelled, murdered, pogroms, inquisitions, and the Holocaust, which many thinkers attribute just simply Christianity. If not Christianity, would never have been possible. There's a book called Faith After the Holocaust by Eliezer Berkovitz. He makes that argument, and others. So this was a very hostile world. So the principles of freedom, especially freedom of religion and freedom of expression, and you can't impede, you can't in any way stop someone from expressing and worshiping as they see fit, obviously benefited. We know of this more as Jews, more than anyone, the benefits. But it was benefits to all of mankind, in truth. So you could say we're in a free world. Why would we even use the word slavery today? But let's explore that. Is slavery only a thing of the past? So we really have to identify what slavery is. If you define slavery as in context of physical bondage, where you are subjugated under the rule of a dictator, under a rule of a group, in hard labor, and you're being abused and oppressed and imposed upon, so there you may argue you're going to find that in certain pockets in the world, but it's not common. On the other hand, if you define slavery in a broader sense, slavery as in a form of, let's call it, addiction, that you are not in control of your own life, then it opens up a whole new series of options. So let's look at our lives today. We may be free in a sense from outside oppression, and there's no one overtaxing us or ready to come and kill us. Well, I wouldn't say that, not ready, but I mean to say that there's a free for all, and there's no series of laws that protect innocent citizens. But when you talk about slavery in a broader sense, many people today more than ever go to what's called therapy. You've heard of this word. Mm-hmm. And no one knows the amount of money spent because many people don't acknowledge they're going to therapy, even though today it's become fashionable, because it's like part of your regimen. However, we don't really know whether it's $1 trillion industry or just a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it's definitely up there. And what is therapy for? Therapy of all kinds of traps, fears, and insecurities that people say enslave us in some way or another. You talk about outright addictions. Addictions are defined as slavery. As soon as any substance, whether it's drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, or overeating, whatever it may be, controls you, that's the definition of slavery. It controls you instead of you controlling it. So it's true, it's not a slavery from without in the sense of someone imposing it on you. You may be imposing it on yourself. Or something in your life is imposing it on you. At the end of the day, we're products of our environments, we're products of our families and our parents, our communities. Many people feel enslaved by that. Some may not feel enslaved even though they are enslaved. Just because somebody, like what is it, 1984, George Orwell says, freedom is slavery, slavery is freedom. Some people think slavery is freedom. But that was also true in real bondage also. There's what's called, what do they call it, the Stockholm effect. When somebody is kidnapped, and they begin to identify with their kidnapper to the point that they feel attached to them. Or you have other scenarios, or even worse type of scenarios. Whether it's God forbid, wife battering or other things that people become addicted to. And maybe because they lose complete self-esteem, so they feel no value, they feel they deserve it, or the known evil is better than the unknown evil. I mean, the whole list of psychological reasons why people can suddenly be in a complete state of helplessness and think that this is salvation for them. Or someone growing up tragically in a very abusive home, and they think abuse is natural, and non-abuse is unnatural, and they expect it. As painful as that sounds, there are people who think that pain is the natural state of being, because that's what they get accustomed to. I don't want to go into a whole elaborate, all the nightmares out there, unfortunately more than we often acknowledge, but it's important to state when we start talking about freedom and slavery and so on. So maybe slavery does not take the same shape as it once did, but it maybe takes on a much more insidious shape today that's far more dangerous. Because it's one thing, you know your enemy is right there, and that you have to figure out how to protect yourself. But what happens when you don't know where the enemy is? What happens if it's in here? What happens where you don't even know where it is, and you don't know when it's going to crop its head? That is a far more complicated enemy. Because when an enemy is an enemy defined, okay, I know where it is, I know I got to protect myself, I know how to fight, and it still doesn't mean it's easy, but it's a defined battle. The worst is when it's a cancer within. There's an expression, the arch enemy of the Jewish people in the Torah is, of course, Amalek. Amalek is an archetype of a force that is of evil, essentially, resident evil. Some associate the Nazis at their worst as being Amalekites, whether literally or metaphorically. But Amalek has many definitions, many manifestations. In the Torah, when Amalek is described in a few different places, the end of the chapter Beshalach, which we'll read in a few weeks, and then again in Kiseitze, in the book of Deuteronomy. So there's the words Asher Karcha Baderech, which means Amalek who met you in the way. The Jews had just left Egypt, suffered for 210 bitter years, and they were weak and demoralized. And Amalek, recognizing that, attacked them, which of course is a real sadistic act. You don't attack someone who is, of course, in a weakened state. But Amalek's Asher Karcha Baderech means it met you in the way. But Karcha also is defined sometimes from the word kerach, which is ice. That Amalek is an archetype of ice-cold attitude, which some people associate actually with the Nazis, that they were cold, they were indifferent. Cold and indifferent to real pain, which allowed them to do what they did. So coldness is the opposite of warmth. Just as I said before, life, a sign of life is mobility and movement. Another sign of life is warmth. What do you associate cold with? Death. Cold corpse. A live body is warm, has certain natural warmth. And even on a simple level, when you say love, we associate love with warmth, with nurturing. Cold is usually associated with something indifferent. You're cold to me. You're far apart from me. Not that there isn't any value to cooling certain things, but real cold is that. Another association with Amalek is called Suffolk, doubt. Amalek is the gematria, the numerical equivalent of doubt. Now you think, doubt? What's so bad about doubt? We all have our doubts. But doubt, when you think about it, is a real enslaving force. Because doubt is worse than an enemy. When someone disagrees with you, they disagree. So you could argue it out, you could review and analyze and evaluate the merits of two sides of an argument, and you decide which one. But when someone throws a doubt into your mind, it paralyzes you. There's no resolution, because you're not sure, this way, that way, this way, that way. So doubt is associated also with a certain cause. Like, let's say you're passionate about something. You wake up one morning, you're excited, I'm going to take on a new challenge, I have a new idea, okay? So there's always guaranteed that there's some people in your Rolodex, whatever they call it today, your contact list. You call them up, guaranteed that they're going to throw some cold water on your idea, and they say, don't get so excited. I remember last time you got so excited. Remember how disappointed you got. I've seen this already. You have these seasoned, experienced, depressed souls that remind us that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Don't get passionate and excited. Okay. And, even worse, they throw in doubts. Now, obviously, any plan needs to be reviewed, but any friend that instead of endorsing and embracing your passion and enthusiasm throws cold, I don't know what kind of friend that is. Now, if they see something dangerous and they want to make you aware, it's one thing. But just to throw it, which is usually just projecting their own failure probably, and as I said earlier, they project their own lack of confidence, and they basically actually don't vergehen is the word, Schadenfreude, that they can't tolerate when someone else is excited because they're never excited. Or some other, I'm not going to analyze anyone without knowing them, but this is a pretty textbook approach. And then, of course, a friend, you call someone up and you tell them such enthusiasm, and instead they say to you, that's great. How could I help you? And they help you infuse you at least with confidence, at least with feeling. Then, of course, there's time to review the plan and make sure it works, etc. But there's a certain power to enthusiasm, and doubt is a kiss of death. It's worse than someone saying no. Because it's like someone, when they say a cream with a nose, they just they smirk. And they throw in that doubt, and you start second-guessing yourself. And we all know second-guessing yourself is one of our worst enemies. And it usually comes, again, especially if someone's a chronic second-guesser. I don't know if that's a categorization in the psychological manuals. A chronic second-guesser often comes from being criticized by parents. That every time a child wanted to do something, they were always criticized. So they start growing up, questioning themselves. Maybe my judgment is off. Something's the matter with me. This all goes into the big word Amalek. And what does it do? It's a form of slavery. So if you start talking about psychological enslavement, we may have far more in slavery today than ever in history. Then it was a slavery from the outside. But I don't know how much the spirit of people were enslaved. As a matter of fact, ironically, some people point out that the Jews were very healthy and strong internally when they were persecuted from outside. And as soon as they were freed from outside, they became very neurotic on the inside. Now, you can explain that, obviously, because you have a defined enemy. And when there's a defined enemy, it crystallizes your own inner... You better have solid resources because you have to survive. When there's no enemy on the outside, we become complacent. Vayishman, Yeshurin, Vayivat is the expression. Yeshurin is the expression for Israel when they get fat with comforts and with pleasures and with indulgences. Vayivat, they begin to, what's the word Vayivat? They begin to brikazech in the Yiddish. Huh?
You give a kick.
Yeah, but it's not just the physical way. They begin to rebel against their own values. Look at the world today. Look at America today. United States today. It's a land of great blessings. There's no question about it. I mentioned before the foundations of this country it's a blessed country. I'm talking about the principles. I'm not talking about every person. I'm not talking about every group. I'm not getting into the specific politics of our time. Overall. And you see it in the last 300 years of this country's history. 250 years. How many years are we? 1776. 250 years. It's been blessed. If you look at the Declaration of Independence and all the other constitutional documents, you're not going to find anywhere that our goal is to make a wealthy country, that we're going to build a lot of businesses. Because they were wise enough to understand, create a healthy environment and you'll have prosperity. So the goal was not to make money. You don't find anywhere in American founding fathers' documents that we're going to become a prosperous country. It was about a country that embraces values, as they say, that are beyond us. And the whole role of government is to cultivate the welfare of its people. United States, that's why it's called United States. Again, I don't want anyone to get the impression I'm naive and I understand plenty of flaws to our situations. But those flaws are not necessarily in those fundamental documents. I'll go a step further. Many people point out, what do you mean all people are created equal? Those same founding fathers were slave owners. But I'll point out this, yes, that was wrong. But something? They still wrote that in the document, and the documents that they wrote that undid slavery that they themselves transgressed. So that's interesting. It was those documents that actually finally Abraham Lincoln and the American people, the citizens, realized that it goes against their fundamental beliefs. So however they justified that dissonance, whether it was because blacks were not human in their minds or half people or whatever it is, but bottom line is that it ultimately was abolished. Now, that creates a healthy climate, a healthy environment. When you have a healthy environment where all people are respected and you give them their rights, they will create a prosperous community. And that's what happened. That's what happened. The fall of the Soviet Union had plenty of power was because ultimately it defiled human dignity. But as much as the Soviet Union's advances, it did not respect the human rights. And that was the ultimate, because once you destroy, who was it that's Richard Branson of Virgin, whatever his companies are, he says, don't focus on your customers, focus on your employees. Create healthy employees and you'll have healthy customers. Because if you don't treat the people with respect, then obviously ultimately the customers are also not going to be treated with respect. So it can't just be for the business of it, Now, there are plenty of flaws in the system, and that's definitely not going to defend capitalism in the full sense of the word. It has its benefits, has its qualities, virtues, has its vices. And of course, people trust. We see issues of regulation and all the breakdown of systems and all the other theories that go on about who's in control and what power there is. But the point I wanted to make was that when you look at when you look at what happened as a result of these freedoms. What's the result? There's been a fundamental breakdown of the soul of people in this country. Now, where do you see that most? You go to young people. You go to young people and ask a young person in this country. You could ask older people as well. They were also once young. We're all younger than we'll be tomorrow, of course. So, in a sense, we're all young. In case you're... yes, what are you ready to fight for? Tell me something, one thing, not a list of 3 things, one thing that you're ready to fight for and to the death. And I don't mean necessarily physically to die, but something that's so important that you would do anything for. Most people, I've tried this. This is not just a theoretical statement. Most people, young people especially, will say, they'll either look at you with a blind stare, blind look, they have no idea what you're talking about. If you ask them what football team they're ready to die for, they'll tell you. What soap opera, what movie, what celebrity they want to meet, no problem. They'll give you a whole list because that's what they live with all day. What video game they're playing and how they're winning it, no problem. This is the side effect, the byproduct, the bad byproduct, obviously, the complacency and the breakdown of values that happens as a result of freedoms. So here suddenly you have freedom, the other side of it. Now, by no means am I suggesting turning the clock back and let's go back to that world. But when you have enemies who are ready to kill you and your family, you can make sure you can bet right that you're going to crystallize your values because you want to live. When you have no one attacking you and you have no enemy, it becomes very much more difficult to crystallize what do you stand for. When the Nazis and the Axis during World War II went to war, at some point, even the United States had to enter because they attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was very clear, there's an enemy that tells you clearly that if you don't do something, I'm going to conquer your land, enslave or kill you, and that's that. So that's the best way to wake you up, to find out what do you stand for. Because if you don't stand for anything, so what? So let's let the Nazis control the world. However, when things are no enemy fighting you, then the question is, what do you stand for? So the blessing suddenly becomes a curse. Now, by no means, again, that doesn't mean the blessing isn't a blessing. It means it's a double-edged sword. So you'll see when people get what they want, and they get everything they've asked for, they will tend to become complacent, and that's where the breakdown begins. Now, when you look at, for example, I'll give you an example. I read it somewhere, I forgot where I read it, but it was very interesting, that society throughout history goes through a five-step cycle throughout history, which approximately takes around 100 years. Every 5 steps go through every 100 years, 150 years, that we go through these 5 steps. The first step is people is oppressed by another people. And then they find freedom. They free themselves. And as they do that, they start building their lives with very healthy values because they knew what slavery was. Now they're free, so they know what was. They know from what was the contrast of what was wrong. They build a healthy world. That health begins to build. Then the generation that experienced the pain and the redemption dies. So the next generation continues building, but slowly their success becomes their undoing. They become successful, and then they begin to become complacent. As they become complacent, they also become conformist, which means everyone's doing the same thing. So the next generation comes and starts rebelling against the conformity and the mediocrity of a comfortable people. And they create a rebellion. And that rebellion disrupts the previous system and creates a new system, and that new system begins again to go through the same processes. So many people attribute, just to give you the sense of it in the United States, so we know, going backwards, the 60s was a time of rebellion against the 50s, which was a time of, like what they call the man in the gray flannel suit, conformity, which came a generation after, of course, a decade after the World War II and World War I, which ravaged the world and the United States. And all of that resulted in what? In a comfort that, again, became too comfortable. There was the rebellion and so on. So it's interesting that it never stays at a status quo. It's always moving. Some people say technology that we have today is speeding things up. And some say now we're at a stage where we're at the beginning of a new stage of comforts. And that will soon be rebelled against, and there'll be a new disruption, a new order will be called for. Wherever we are, that's another discussion. But the point of the matter is that freedom ends up becoming slavery because you start taking for granted your gifts. And when the Torah says, for example, besides Vayishma, Yeshurun, Vayiv, it says, Keichi v'eitzim yadi, you start saying, I did all this for myself. I don't owe it to anybody, not my parents, not those that came before us, not God. Once you lose that, then you become your own self-made person. That is always the beginning of every downfall of every civilization. Because you lose humility, and you become complacent, and you become comfortable. And things are fine. I discussed this last week at length, whether you can grow without pain. There's no question you could, but it's much more easier with pain, let's put it that way, as strange as that sounds. Because it challenges your comfort zones. And comfort zones, as beautiful as they are never healthy and never conducive for growth. So when we look at our time today, if you think of it in that context, slavery, we may be more enslaved than ever before. We're just not enslaved to another country, to another monarch, to another person. We're enslaved by the freedoms that we are living in. So let's take, for example, technology. Technology is a good one. The addictions I mentioned before, the traps of the communities we are in, that for sure has enslaving elements to it. But let's take technology. That was supposed to emancipate us. Technology. You don't have to go anywhere. You can press a button, get anything you want at any given time. Who doesn't think technology is frees your time up, frees your challenges? You can access any information you want, etc., etc., etc. But what has it done to the human soul and to the human heart? With all what we call communication revolution, information revolution, are we truly more informed people? Are we more sensitive? Do we really love people more? You know, they say social media was invented by people who are antisocial. And you see the experts in social media, most of them are not at all social people. So they created, some say, a type of virtual friendship called like Facebook friends. You never have to meet them. So it's perfect for an antisocial person. Social media is a perfect solution. Now, I'm not suggesting it can be used for good purposes, but it's interesting what you can create out there. So we talk about communications. Has communication really been better? Do you think husbands and wives, parents and children, friends communicate better today? We have better tools, but communication has nothing to do with tools. Communication has to do with the heart. Words from the heart enter the heart, the Rabbeinu Tam writes. Words from the mouth come out, from the mouth go into one ear and out the other. Technology can't change that. If it's not from the heart, there's no machine in the world that's going to make it come from the heart. What do they call it? They used to call it junk in, junk out in computers. Garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, computing crunches numbers. It speeds everything up. But what is everything? If it's junk, it'll speed junk up. You'll have more nonsense in your life and an accelerated pace. And if it's beautiful things, it'll speed that up too. So technology should not be confused with progress. It's progress it's basically a better tool chest, but it's all who uses the tools. It doesn't make a better human being. And this doesn't require deep philosophy. It's basic given. It's just that it creates such distraction that it's just another soap opera. It's another television show. You have so much streaming into your life, consciously and unconsciously, that you're not even thinking about it. Now, I'm not here as a fire and brimstone talk about the vices of technology. I'm talking about human to human here, soul to soul. And some people, my father used to collect, let's have open heart surgery, in a good sense, heart to heart. Let's talk heart to heart, man to man, woman to woman. So you deal with a world where we can be convinced that we're free. And I think, I have not been in other generations, but what I see, I don't see freedom at all. I see people enslaved in worst possible ways to their fears, to their insecurities. And it's even worse because they have gadgets that make you feel free. Like suddenly someone will say, you know what? I was living in not reality, but now I watch reality TV. Now I'm in reality. You love when you hear that. Oh, how Walter Matthau put it this way. He says, listen, look at this. It's authentic imitation leather. It's authentic imitation leather. How could you drink Diet Coke? It's not the real thing. You got to drink the real thing. Coke itself is real. You understand? That's the world in which we live. Or when the World Trade Center, God forbid, when they flew the planes in there, someone said, just like a movie. The movie became the standard, and now reality is like we're trying to figure out how reality fits into the films. Now, this is not exaggeration what I'm saying, because when you think about it, they say statistics show that by the time we're age 20 years old in the Western world, the average man or woman at 20 years old has seen 1 million advertisements, seen or heard. Now you think that's a lot, right? But think about it. What does it mean, seen? It means all the billboards, magazines, newspapers, whatever you have, mobile, even things you may not have registered. I understand there's some people who've been completely sheltered and haven't seen anything. Fine, so age 30, add another 10 years. But the point of the matter is, these things have an impact. Advertising business is not billions of dollar business for no reason. It's because they know it impacts us. And it may not impact you the first time. Subliminally, it impacts every time. What do they say? You have to see it 18 times. That's why the 18th email, you start saying, hey, you know what? Let me consider it. When the first time you got it, you said, this is garbage. What do I need it for? Because there's something that happens. You see something. Many times it has some repetitive thing. Now, I'm not here to give you some tricks of the trade how to manipulate people. I met a guy, I knew him many years ago. He was a psychotherapist. He was excellent, psychologist, helped many people. And we meet, and I say, what do you do today? He's no longer in that business. What do you? He's in advertising. I said, how'd you get from helping, psychology to advertising? He says, I'm doing exactly the same thing I always did, but for more money, a lot more money. I used to help people with psychological issues. Now I manipulate them with psychology. Then I thought to myself, I said to him, you know what? You remind me of the radar company, the radar detector companies. They make the radars, then they make a better radar detector, and then they sell that to the police. Then they make even a better. It's like the guy who's making the mouse and the mouse traps, and you make money from both sides because you're always improving each one. That's a great business model. That way you're making money from both sides. So I said, so what's going to happen is that after you make enough people unhealthy with your manipulation, you'll probably go back to therapy and heal them all. He said, yeah, that's a good idea. I said, you could do both at the same time. You could say, I have real experience. I know how to manipulate people, so I know how to heal them too. Anyway, this is half humorous, but you get the idea. That's the world in which we live. And I can tell you that. I've been offered, without kidding, I usually don't talk about this, I've been offered pretty good money because of my own experience with psychology and emotions to get involved in that type of work. It's not outright manipulation. It's for the good of them. It's for the good for people. We have to sell them a product. They don't know yet it's good for them. So how do we convince them it's good for them? Now, do you have any ulterior motives, or you're purely doing it for the good of mankind? And I'm not suggesting every product is bad, but you get the idea, the mindset. It's all about how it sells. Now, some of us can sell our souls out and become involved in that, and however we justify it. We all have, it's called Ein Adam Evra Aveira Elim Ken Nichnas Bei Ruach Shtus. Means a person doesn't sin unless there's a moment of insanity. So we become insane, and we get blinded, and we convince ourselves the ends justify the means, because if I get wealthy, then I'll give a lot of charity, and I'll help the whole human race. Okay, we all know the what's it called? The shtick, the line, whatever you want to call it, yes. But the point I'm trying to make is that, you go back to what does Judaism teach us? Judaism teaches that perhaps there was one nation and one people, I'm not saying every one of them, but at least the nation as a whole, starting with Avram Avinu, Abraham, that money was not the first thing, and manipulation was not the first, and the means did not justify the ends. People who dedicated their lives to what it says in the Torah, Lasei Tzedakah Mishpat. That's where it began. As I mentioned, even this country, even the United States doesn't say anywhere that the business plan of this country is, let's create freedom of religion. That way we'll attract a lot of people, especially Jews, will make us a lot of money. No one ever said that. It doesn't say it anywhere. It was the exact opposite. Create a healthy society and automatically you'll have prosperity. Anyone that starts the other way around, I'm going to have prosperity and that's why I'm going to create a healthy society, you can know, rest assured where that's going. Because there's a very clearly an ulterior motive that's going to cloud the judgment of how this should be run. No charity has been generated more than in a country like this. Not just by the country itself, which spends billions of dollars on charity, and the taxpayers approve of it, which itself is unprecedented, but also look at the latest giving pledge of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and actually embarrassing mostly Jews in the big high brackets to give 90% of the giving pledge. Go to givingpledge.com and you'll see it all. And compelling them that in their lifetimes to give away 90% of their value, of their wealth. Now you could say, okay, and 10% of $20 billion is also pretty good. But still, greed is greed, and most people don't want to give away their money. It's not natural in this material world to do so. So these are some of the signs, positive signs. Whether you agree with where that charity is going or not, and I'm sure many of us are cynical and say, yeah, there's probably some tax break or something. Go look into it and see. Yes, there are tax breaks, but 90% is a lot of money. You can get tax breaks without giving that much. Now, the point I'm going back to is, let's go back for a moment, because like a Bill Gates was at the top of his career. It's not when he was 60 years old he retired and decided to come give back. You read what he writes. He writes, there came a point, I made so much money, what am I going to, I have no ambition anymore in making money. 70 billion, 80 billion. Where are you going to go with that? He's not going to build a country. In the olden days, someone with that type of money would go build a country, an empire, an army, and become, a Julius Caesar, another emperor. Interesting, in his 40s, literally in 40s, it's like 40s as a young man, would go off completely into putting all his energies into charities. Again, whether you agree with the charities, it's a different story. I find that pretty amazing. Because it means he came to the pinnacle. And I know many of us are saying, I'll make 80 billion, I'll also go into charity. Yeah, but you know what? Not how many people you know are doing that. And you don't have to wait till 80. Most people can live with 1 billion, you also have more than you can ever spend. So, because clearly, and I've met him, but I read about him, and I see, because he realized that he'll be enslaved by the money that he's made, unless he does something that gives back. And you'll see it time and again. And as much as we understand it logically, the seduction of the material world is so profound that even if our minds tell us otherwise, we are constantly being hypnotized by this world. And that's the ultimate slavery. So let's put it in more Kabbalistic terms, but it's a little example. I read about a guy, Lower East Side, a few years ago. People knew him. He was a single, what they call Alta Bocher, an old bachelor in his 80s, late 80s, never married, no children, no family, obviously. And no one knew, but he would walk around. He looked like a homeless person. And he died. And they discovered $1.4 billion in his accounts.
Billion or million?
Billion. Yeah. Okay. And he accumulated it over the years. What happened? Every penny went to the government. He had no heirs. He had no will. Nothing. So all went to the government. Then I read that, you could check it out, we know his name, and that when he was asked for charity, some people knew that he had something, they didn't know what. No, he was so stingy with the two types of stinginess. People are stingy with others, and people are stingy with themselves. Obviously, the second one is B'chal Masai money. You never find someone stingy with themselves and not stingy with others. But someone stingy with others, but not with themselves, that you find. Okay, so he was stingy, and in his own mind, and I've met many people, maybe people think until the last second of this earth that some way they're going to figure out how to take the money with them. But no one has mastered that art. So you know clearly that no matter how much money you make in this world, I'm taking money, specifically money as an example, you will never take it with you forever. There's no way. Okay, so you say to yourself, I'll leave it for my children, my grandchildren. But we also know another rule, that almost likely that any body of wealth By the time it hits second or third generation, either will all be lost due to bad mistakes, or you will usually create war in the family. This is documented. Because that's what money does. Between brothers and sisters, between grandchildren for sure, the cousins, and so on and so forth. Okay. But the seductive power of it is literally, I'll just compare it just as I don't like to use this more crass example, it's essentially just like a sexual seduction. At the moment, you lose complete logic. And you'll do whatever it takes, even if it's completely not rational. Even if it's destructive. Even if you know it's destructive. Here, everybody knows it's temporary. But still, as the words in the Gemara, the classic words, we will choose Chaya Shah over Chaya Elam. We'll choose temporary life over permanent life. That's how it is. Now how? How is that possible? How can intelligent people do that? Someone said to you right now, here I give you something that will last only a short period of time, but it's a tremendous treasure. And here's a treasure that's maybe less in quantity, but it will last forever. What will most people choose? They'll choose the moment. I was at a Torah science conference a few weeks ago, actually Shabbos Chanukah, it was a month ago, I guess, in Miami Beach, in Bell Harbor. And there was a doctor, he's the, what's his name, Rosniak, he's the head of cardiology at St. Luke's here, Roosevelt Hospital in New York. Forgot his name. Come to me in a moment. He gave a very interesting talk about heart disease and health, and healthy heart and anxiety. And he says, of course, the biggest challenge is people come to you, they have problems with their heart or potential problems, and you tell them they have to change their diet, exercise, other things, especially when you let them see the consequences, very clearly this is dangerous or death-threatening and so on. And you have children, you have grandchildren, you want to be at their weddings. There's many motivations that are very selfish even. He says, and everybody, of course, in the office says, you're right, doctor. No one ever says you're wrong. You're right. Tell me what I have to do. And they mean it. They're sincere. And yet, they leave the office, not necessarily a moment later, maybe 2 moments later, 3 moments later, and nobody lives up to what they committed to. And it's a fascinating phenomenon because we're not talking about spiritual, religious beliefs. You're talking about something that's going to affect your health. It's your life. Who doesn't care about their life? Everybody wants to live longer. Everybody wants to be healthy. Who wants to die young, etc., God forbid. So it's not like there's no motivation. And they know about it. So he's wondering, what's the blind spot? What happens? So he said that he got some answers from Torah. And he started seeing it like the Yetzer Hara approach. You may know it's wrong, but there's something about the momentary pleasure of something that psychologically is more powerful than the long-term benefits. So your mind tells you there's long-term benefits, but your emotions are consumed by the short-term pleasure. And it's always the case that short-term pleasure will trump long-term benefits, even if you understand it all. So he went into a whole discussion how you change that and how you could help people get beyond that. He had a whole bunch of serious, interesting ideas. But I remember it struck me because he was looking at it from a medical point of view, and I deal with it obviously in a psychological point of view all the time. And we all face this. How many of us give good advice to others that we don't take to ourselves? That's like the ultimate, paradox. You can give someone advice that you yourself don't follow. And it's brilliant advice. As soon as it comes to you, there's a different lens. Because just like, you ever hear your voice on recording, like audio recording of your voice? Does anybody like their voice on audio recording? You say to yourself, well, this guy sounds like weird. Whether it's now I can tell you, I have plenty of recordings, and people compliment me. They say, I love your talks. I love this. I listen to myself. I can't say, how could anybody listen to this guy? Because we don't hear ourselves. The voice you're hearing is not the voice I'm hearing, because I'm hearing it from within or whatever, like underwater, whatever, however you want to figure it out. And I guess there are singers and maybe anchor people and people on television and actors that learn to like their voice. Maybe they don't. Bottom line is you're not forced. I'm not forced to listen to myself, so it's fine. Others like it, listen to hey, The point I'm trying to make is that we don't see ourselves the way we see others, or the way others see us, and vice versa. So what we have here is a tremendous blind spot, which, frankly, Jewish thinkers from the beginning of time have tried to figure out, how does that work? What would blind somebody to that extent that till the last breath they think they can take their money with them? And they know, you can give it to a good cause. You can give it to tzedakah, and it's still so difficult. Do you know anybody on this? I mean, I should say there are exceptions. Do you know anybody that it's easy for them to put their hand in their pocket and give you any money they have? There are natural balei tzedakah that love to give tzedakah. It's an interesting phenomenon, but most are not that way. In Tanya, chapter 37, he analyzes it brilliantly. He says, because money, he calls chaye nefesh. What does that mean, chaye nefesh? Because money is a symbol for everything we value. Our time, our energy, our ingenuity, our creativity. It's like a symbol of everything. So it's like called soul money, soul power. So he says, when it comes to someone asking you, for example, when it comes to a certain transgression or mitzvah, there, the Yetzer Hara, the negative, the impulse, will challenge you. But when it comes to something that represents all of you, your entire animal soul is invested in it because it represents all of you. So it's not easy. That's why it's so difficult for a person to tear money away, because they feel it's like they're tearing their flesh. You're tearing your dam basar, which is, by the way, one of the reasons we sometimes give money instead of fasting, because it's like chaye nafshi. It's like giving of your flesh and blood, because money represents food you could have bought or other things that sustain you. It's not just another thing. And that's why he explains that tzedakah shkula keneged kol mitzvah. That's why tzedakah, charity, is such a powerful mitzvah, and it's tatzim u'mavis. Why would charity save from death? And that it says even the only mitzvah God says, test me with this mitzvah, because it's the mitzvah that most captures the tentacles of materialism's hold on us. Money is the biggest power. And you just see it, how difficult. I was reading an article a few years ago, I remember, I think in the New York Times. So they had a group of friends met. They were talking about everything. They talked about all their private lives, their intimacy, their everything. And one person asked the other and said, so how much money do you have put away? They froze. They're ready to talk about their sex lives, about every stupid secret in their lives. Money suddenly is the thing nobody talks about. It's interesting. So all this is just, from my point of view, talk about slavery. So the thinkers all try to understand this. The Arizal, maybe the most innovative of all, the great mystic, 16th century, writes, or he didn't write, he spoke, but his student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, wrote, called Kisvei Arizal. However, he didn't write most of it, didn't write any of it actually. So he calls the classic idea what's called the Tzimtzum Harishon. What's the Tzimtzum Harishon? The Tzimtzum Harishon is the great concealment, or the great contraction. You could use the language of today, physics, the black hole. And with that he comes to explain many quandaries, philosophical and psychological quandaries, including this issue. How is it possible that the truth of value can become so distorted that we can value something that's completely false and dismiss something that's completely real in this world? It's one thing if you could say some things can be sold to us that are false, but it's like an inverted reality. You can convince yourself that the glove is more important than the hand inside the glove. You look at the world around you, and instead of looking at what's behind the scenes, we look at what's on the cover of everything. The most distorted cliche of all, don't judge a book by its cover. Do you know anyone that doesn't judge a book by its cover? I've never met anyone. As a matter of fact, as an author, I can tell you they spend billions of dollars on producing and designing covers, because that's exactly what people look at. The cover, the package. You ever see how products are produced? Tell me they invest more in the packaging than in the product. That's why you sometimes come home with a big package and a very small product, but the package is very impressive. Apple is a big master of that. Now that doesn't mean the product isn't valuable, but packages absolutely matter. People look only at packages. That's how you sell something. How is that possible? So the Arizal says, because God, in creating the universe, did something before the universe itself was created. He inverted reality. He made us think light is dark and dark is light. What is real became a novelty for us, and what is false became real. Lev Yitzchak Berditchever was once said in his classic way, return to God and look for ways to find merit in the Jewish people. He says, a kunz. A kunz means a trick you pulled off, he tells God. You gave the people to live through a difficult life, to give them a material world with all its contemptations and seductions, and you tell them in the books about what Olam Haba, the world to come, is, the pleasures of the world to come, of the spiritual worlds. Why don't you give them the spiritual worlds to live through and write in the books about what material life is like? And you'll see how they'll behave. What is he saying? He made the material world so compelling and so seductive, and you tell us that there's spirituality and the spiritual reward, and if you do the right things, you'll be rewarded and you'll be given deeper, soulful experiences. You should turn it around. So the Arizal explains basically, using a good example maybe, there was this, sometimes they tell the story of a chassid and a misnagid. In case anybody's offended by those terms, we'll use the terms philosopher and a rabbi if you like. You figure out who's who. So you have these two people debating, that's called the skeptic and the believer. Maybe that's the best. So the believer believes, of course, in God, and the skeptic has questions. And they're debating the issue. Now you can imagine, I'm sure everybody's had these what we call the long marathon debates that go nowhere about the topic. And back and forth, the proofs for God, the proofs against God, the agnosticism, and this thing, the different views. Finally, the chassid, the believer, says to the other guy, the skeptic, he says, you know something? I really envy you. Why do I envy you? Because you really think about God all the time. And I have to be honest, and admit, I think about myself all the time. And with that, they part ways. Now, this skeptic, who obviously also had a measure of arrogance, thought this was a great compliment. Here he gets this great believer, this great rabbi, teacher. Everybody admires, to say that he's selfish and thinks about himself, and this skeptic thinks about God. Until a few years pass, and either he matures or he meets somebody that enlightens him and says, no, he didn't actually compliment you, he actually insulted you. Because what he meant was the following. He says, you think about God all the time because you know you exist. You don't have to think about it. It's a given that you, Aniva Avsiye, that you and nobody else exists, that's for sure. Your question is whether God exists, so you think about it all the time. You contemplate, maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist, and so on. For the believer, it's the other way around. He knows God exists. So he thinks about himself all the time. Do I exist? Am I an illusion? Why do I exist? I need to justify my being. Now this isn't just semantics. It's really two realities. It's two realities. Many people feel, and there's even Jewish thinkers that feel this way, even in the religious world, that Hashemayim la'Hashem, ha'aretz nasan l'bnei Adam. Heaven was given to God, but earth belongs to human beings. Oz l'karta holach b'nemusa means you come to a city and you follow its customs. As they say, you come to Rome, you do as the Romans do. And some Jews, even devout Jews, think that means literally. That God said, here you follow the rules of the material, secular world. They'll say, obviously, without breaking halacha, without breaking Jewish law, but we are subject, we are enslaved to the rules of this material world. And then there are those that will say, like the Arizal and others, no. God wants us to come in this world, but never think this world controls you. You're here to elevate the world, not to become subjugated to it. And I don't just mean in behavior, it means psychologically. You're here to elevate. If Mordechai of the time of Purim lived in the 20th century, and he was hanging around in Washington, like he'd hung then around Shushan Habira, or in the different high echelons of power, there are many Jews that would say to him, you know something, Mordechai, you're a very fine man, but when Haman comes by and he's the top minister, we all acknowledge him. And don't ruffle feathers and don't rock the boat, and bow to him like we all bow to him. That's how it is. We need him. We need his favors, and therefore, for the long-term benefit of the Jewish people, we need you to respect him. And what did Mordechai say? La yichur v'la yishtachve. He not only didn't bow, he made sure to make a point that he would not, because we don't serve anyone that's not God. Avodi atem v'lo avodi la'avodim. We're servants to God, not servants to servants. And this has been the policy and the principles that Jews upheld. Because we come to this world not to become subjugated by it because it belongs to the other side. We come to this world to refine and elevate it, and not to compromise. And the fact that we dress in the garments and we follow the customs of the land, because that's part of our mission, is to speak the language of the land, but never think you become of it. You're always within it, but you're above it. That is the secret to not becoming enslaved. You know, there's an expression, no one is free except someone who studies Torah. It's interesting. It doesn't say, Kol misha esik b'Torah hu ben cher. It doesn't say if you study Torah, you're free. It says without studying Torah, you can't be free. Which tells you can study Torah and do mitzvahs and still be enslaved. Why? Because you could be technically, mechanically doing mitzvahs, you could be mechanically studying, but it could be completely a form of slavery, even slavery to your own conformity to your community, or slavery that you're still enslaved by your animal soul and evil inclination. On the other hand, why can't you be free without the Torah? Because the Torah gives you a perspective that teaches you that you're not of this world. You're not defined by this world. You're not trapped by it. You're not enslaved to it. Nothing in this world can control you. But you have to firmly, absolutely believe that. And only Torah can lead you there. Because if you study science and you study other systems, Chachma b'goyim tamen, there's much wisdom out there. But it's wisdom of the world. In the words of some scientists, you cannot change a system from within a system. The system of existence and its science cannot teach you how to transform existence. It can teach you to understand existence. But a system that comes out of the ego cannot transform the ego. Torah teaches you of a different reality. Torah b'goyim altamen, which means it's a different reality. It's a reality called transcendence. It's not made of this world. It's not understanding the physics or the mechanics or the chemistry or the biology of this universe. It's trying to understand God. And once you go to that place, that's what keeps you, that's what makes you a free person. So slavery and freedom has a whole different meaning in that context. Not whether somebody has their fist, their foot on your head and oppressing you. That's a physical, limited sense. So slavery is when you're enslaved by your own desires, by your own perspective of this material, by your money, yes, and by your sexuality, and by everything else that traps us. There's this famous story, I always repeat it because it's just a very powerful story. 1927. It was the previous Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneers, who was a prime example of what we're talking about, because he did not live in easy times. You're talking about the former Soviet Union in 1927 was harsh. Stalin had come to power then, and religion they saw as the opiate of the masses, as an enemy to the mother, to the Soviet Union, and they did everything to abolish religion. Now you remember, they say 10 million Jews, if not more, lived in Russia at the time. And they determined suddenly to abolish everything that's Jewish. Of course, Jews were always at the brunt more than the other religions. And who was the worst anti-Semites? Of course, are the Jews, the Jewish anti-Semites. They were called the Yevsektia. It's a Russian term for the Jewish, what's the word? The Jewish unit. Huh? Apostates. No, not apostates. The Jewish union of communists, the communist branch of the Jewish branch, and they, of all people, were the most rabid anti-Semites who wanted to do everything to eliminate Judaism. And they knew the strength of Judaism. They grew. Their grandparents were Hasidim, actually. So when they came to arrest, they saw Rabbi Schneerson, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, as a threat because he would not bend. So they thought that if they could arrest him and kill him, it would eliminate the resistance, so to speak. Now remember, that was also a period where the first immigration of Jews that came to America came essentially in the early 20th century due to the pogroms. That was before the Soviets took over, before the Bolsheviks. That was more the Tsarist Russia. I mean, the upheavals of that time were hard to describe. So 1927, they finally arrest him. Now we know a lot of what happened because he documented it. He actually wrote something called Masechta Gehenim, the Tractate from Hell, because he describes the hell of his Soviet imprisonment, which you can imagine, there was not exactly due process. There was no court of laws, there was no justice, there were no lawyers. It was just, you're completely subject to the whims of a whole bunch of animals, basically. Now, he's arrested, and he writes in his Yaman, his diary, that he writes in that besides the torture and other things, he also, for his own dignity, he said that he refused to cooperate. He said to himself, you know what, they can enslave my body, but they can't enslave my soul, and therefore I refuse to cooperate. He spoke fluent Russian, he insisted on speaking Yiddish. Now they knew Yiddish, of course, all of them, the ones, his captors. And then a whole list of things, I'm not going to go through all the details. There's one particular episode where he's speaking to a man called Lulav. Lulav was one of his captors, one of the Jewish. Now Lulav's grandfather was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the grandfather of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe. So when they arrested him, Lulav said to him, or Nachmanson, there were two, Lulav and Nachmanson were the two main Yevsexian people. One of them said, Rebbe, he called him Rebbe, he says, let me carry your bags, when they took him to the prison. Let me carry your bags as my grandfather carried your grandfather's bags. And the Rebbe refused. He said, your grandfather carried my grandfather's bags where my grandfather wanted to go. And you're carrying my bags where you want me to go, and that not. No. All in Yiddish, mind you. Okay? They come to prison, and the torturing and whatever they did, they wanted to elicit, of course, confessions. And they couldn't budge this Rebbe, obviously. Especially he made that decision that he was not going to budge and compromise in any way. So finally, I think it was Lulav who pointed a pistol to his head, to the Rebbe's head, and said, listen, Rebbe, in Yiddish, this is a place where you're told what to do. You don't choose what you do. And this pistol here has changed many people's mind to cooperate. That's what he told him, in Yiddish. And he responded, the Rebbe looked at him and said to him, this toy, this tzatske, he called it, this toy, can only frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds. And that's what he said, unblinking. So he was so furious, Lulav, he said to him, Rebbe mivran vervet eisfirn. We will see who will prevail. And the Rebbe said to him, yeah, mividzen vervemen. We'll see who will prevail. Now the end of the story is critical to know. Because he could have been shot on the spot. It was very easy. It was not a problem for them to do so. But for whatever reason, they didn't. Lulav, obviously, all these people were shot because they didn't last long. The whole thing was driven by a reign of fear by Stalin. Everybody was killed. There was nobody that lasted. And the Rebbe was freed from prison. He came to America, actually, in 1940 and lived till 1950 here in the United States. So his words, who will prevail, we'll see who we've seen. But the words that he answered, you'd think, okay, listen, it's a nice, cute line. But it wasn't a cute line. This is being said with a gun at his head in a place where not exactly people came out living. They killed people without any reasons there. But the presence to be able to say that is obviously the presence that any one of us can understand. It's like when you ask Holocaust survivors. I asked this question to a few that I've met in my life. Eli Wiesel, one of them was friends with my father, and others. And I said, is it true that the Jews sang Ani Mamin, I believe with complete faith, when they went to the gas chambers? So he told me, and a few others told me, that they were in different areas of the camp, so they really couldn't see or hear what was going on the other side of the camp. They kept them separate. But many times at night, I heard Shema, Krishma, I heard Kaddish, other prayers, Ani Mamin as well. So, of course, the obvious question to any spoiled American brats like us is, how is that possible? The Jews are not insane. You're living in the worst hell, probably in all of history. Haster Aster Panai in the deepest sense, where concealment of God is not even, you're talking about here, not just concealment. The opposite, complete control by every force that's... And why? Because Jews are Jews, and why is God quiet? Ayeh Elekechem, we say, right? Ayeh, where is God? Our enemies will say, where is your God? And that's what the Nazis did, taunting. And yet the Jews had that, where did that come from? They should have been angry at God. Fine, you don't want to express your anger. But to say prayers and blessings and I believe... Walk into a gas chamber, millions of Jews, 1.5 million innocent children for no reason. It's almost impossible to imagine. However, I think this resonates with all of us when you hear the answer. And the answer that you hear time and again, ask anyone that was in that situation. Again, this is not like a nice Hollywood film. We're talking about real life here. Real life and death, I should say. You'll hear the answer when these words are different words. And it goes like this. They could take our bodies, but they can't take our souls. That's what the song and the prayers meant. You could take our lives, but you can't take our faith. You could take us, but you're not going to take our children. And if it won't be us, it'll be our children. And if it won't be our children, it'll be our grandchildren. But we will prevail. In different words, what the Prediker Rebbe said. You can frighten someone that has one world and many gods. Why? Because he has no other world. That's it. Take the world, that's it. We're not embracing death. But you think you're going to frighten me because of a gun? And my faith and my soul is going to become frightened because you're taking away some temporary life of mine? Again, of course, nobody wants to die. But that's what it meant. So it wasn't some type of naive, delusional state. We're singing Ani Mamin, and we think this is Gan Eden here. Obviously, they knew where they were. But they never lost their dignity, even in the most undignified situations. And I'm not saying everybody. There were Jews that behaved in ways that we know we're not very proud of. But, we don't talk about that so much. But we talk about the Gdeshim. And we talk about that story you hear about one of the Nazis about to kill a Jew. And the Jew asks to say something. What do you want to say? So he starts saying his prayers, vidui, or whatever it was, his prayers. And the Nazi says, what are you saying? He says, I'm thanking my God. What are you thanking your God for, miserable Jew? I'm about to kill you. I'm the one that's in control. Where's your God? So he said, I'm thanking God for not creating me like you. This is what it comes down. We could suffer, but we're not sufferers. And this is ultimately the reason we're here today. Because, and this is the challenge, our challenge of our times is the slavery of our times is the hardest slavery of all. It's not as painful, perhaps, and it's not as life-threatening, but it's life-threatening to our souls, because it's very easy to lose your soul today. Because we're free. We can do whatever we want. We don't have to fight for ourselves. I mean, obviously we have our challenges in Israel and other places, but it's not at all like what it was. So the first thing we have to recognize is that the material Olam Hazeh does enslave us, period. The Arizal, in his brilliant understanding of the Tzimtzum, explains how it's possible. Because God, yes, turned the whole thing inside out where you can convince yourself that the glove is more important than the hand. As crazy as that sounds. And that the eggshell is more important than the egg. And that you could be worshipping. That's why klippa is called klippa. You hear the word klippa very often. Klippa. Klippa is a word that often people translate as evil. Klippa means a shell, a husk. The Shalar writes, klippa kodma lepri. The reason there's a klippa is in order to protect the fruit inside. Why do we have an orange peel, a potato peel, an eggshell? To protect the fruit. Where does it become a klippa and a negative? When you start worshipping the peel and forget there's a fruit inside. That's the story of our lives. This material world is a husk, a shell. As I said at the outset of this class, constant renewing energy beneath the surface. But we worship the shell, because that's our reality. An analogy they give for it is of imagine a family that is, in the olden days they had the parrots who, the landowner, you couldn't pay your dues, they put you into prison. So imagine the whole family is in a prison, not in a prison, in a pit. So just an analogy given. But the pit is, you can build a whole life in this pit. And they start building a life. But the people who are in prison there know that this is a prison. This is a pit. And they know when they look up, they see the hole on top, they know that's the place where there's freedom. Their children know it also because their parents told them. But then the next generation, the grandparents die. The next generation is born in this pit. And they start saying, 1 second, we don't belong. This is where we are. What are you talking about? This is where we belong. We've always been here. And you can imagine, as every next generation becomes more skeptical, they say, no, you see that hole up there? They say, no, that hole's like a sun. That's all it is. This is natural. Our darkness, our pit is our natural reality. And you can imagine after several generations, psychologically, what happens is, you start thinking, this is reality, and that's fantasy. That's some story. Our great-grandparents, they wanted to have some hope and faith or whatever it is, so they convinced themselves they really belong up there where there's free. There's nothing there. It's a hole it's like where the sun. This is exactly what happens. In the olden days in Russia, when there was very hot days, there was no air conditioning, so you would get some relief by going down into a basement, a cellar which was very cold and cool, but there was also no electricity, so it was very dark. So a chassid once went down there, and he says, it's so dark down here. So the other people who were there already cooling off say, don't worry, stay here for a while, you get used to it. And he said, that's exactly what I'm worried about, to get used to it. And suddenly you convince yourself darkness is light, and freedom is slavery, and slavery is freedom. So he wasn't so far off Orwell when he made those statements. It's not difficult to convince people who are slaves that they're free. It's hard to do, you know when there was real slavery. The bondage in Egypt was pretty hard to convince people it's freedom. Even then there were people that thought there was, and they wanted to go back to Egypt, etc., or not leave. But today it's very easy, because you could say, what do you mean? No one's tying, no one's keeping me, I'm not in shackles, I'm not in a prison. I have all the gadgets in the world, I could access everything on my mobile phone. Nobody's telling me what to do. But, as we all know, there's the demons within, there's the psychological slavery of the material world. And you could fill in the blanks yourself, everybody could define it. And Yediyas Hamach Lechetzi Refuah. Knowing the problem is half the cure. Until you don't recognize the things that enslave you today, you are a deep slave. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing, I'm just saying it as, well, it is a bad thing. I'm saying it as a statement. I meant to say, I'm not trying to say it as a critical. I'm saying it more in a statement that we have to discover that. And how you discover that? Well, you have to start seeing other perspectives than your own, because your own perspective is just going to reinforce your own viewpoints. Number two, you have to be around people who found some type of emancipation and freedom. And yes, you have to figure out how to free yourself from some of these so-called forces that we think are so emancipating. Maybe that's why Shabbos is such a powerful day today more than ever. You know, once upon a time, Shabbos meant, yes, you don't light fires. Today it's a switch. Some people say, what's the big thing? A switch. I understand. To go light a fire, we shouldn't go light fires. It's a big thing, creation. But a switch. So I once saw an answer. Yeah, what do you think? And creating the world for God is it's even less than a switch. And God rested even from that. It didn't take him a lot to create a universe. It's not the effort you make, it's what you create. So maybe today we see the blessing of Shabbos when it comes to our gadgets and our internets and our external media. Because you always think of it, what is malacha at the end of the day? Malacha is something, is not your natural self. That's what it comes down to. What's a malacha? The Lamed test, the 39 types of work. Something outside of you. Malacha shamayim, to work with your heart and soul, to express love, to study, to pray, that's also work. But that's amal teira, amal sicha. That's not forbidden on Shabbos. On the contrary, that's the 40th malacha, they say. The 40 minus 1. What's the 1? The 1 is the one that you're allowed to do. So maybe there's a great blessing in that, because you're forced to sit with your children and family, and you're forced to have a conversation maybe that's not dependent on a text or some other fast food environment. Now, I said this to a number of people a few weeks ago. We were talking. So some people telling me they happen to be, I guess, Shomer Shabbos, but it comes to their mobile phones. They're not so Shomer Shabbos, whatever reason. They're addicted to it. I don't think it's necessarily business, but whatever it is, they're not. They're strong. So I said, you need it more than anybody, because you're so trapped by it. It's your drug. So bottom line is, we live in a world where there's a whole new form of slavery, and until we don't recognize that, and we don't see a transcendent dimension that you're involved in, you are enslaved. Now I know some people are going to say, so what? I feel good about it. What do I care if I'm enslaved? Okay, that we'll reserve for another discussion. For people who feel that it's not so bad, and I just can't cover everything in one class here. I see it's already getting later, and I know there's a curfew in New York. So let me conclude by saying the following. They say, tzaddikim gambe misasan kruim chaim. Tzaddikim, even in their lives, great righteous people, even in their lifetimes are called, even in their deaths are called alive. And wicked people, even in their lifetimes, are called dead. Do I need to explain that? The reason for that is because we have to understand where is the source of freedom and life. Atem advekim b'Hashem elkeichem chayim kol chamayim. understanding the value of permanent chayil olam, permanent life over temporary life, is the key to everything. Now, obviously, when I say death, nobody wants death. We want to have eternal life. We want to have a life of souls inside bodies. But if you talk about value, it's very easy to live a life and convince yourself everything is going well when in fact you're really dead. And when I mean dead, I don't mean in the biological sense, I mean in the emotional sense, in the spiritual sense. It's the saddest thing to see people who are zombies, who are maybe going through all the motions, but they don't have that the zest, the verve, the vivacity, the vitality of what makes life life. And that's far deeper than just someone that has energy and is driven or is fit. You could be physically fit and still be emotionally dead. What we have the opportunity is to recognize is that we all have souls that are ticking inside of us, and those souls are desperately hungry, and the only way that you could feed them is not through anything that's materialistic. There's no machine, there's no technology that can feed them. The only thing that can feed them is love, nurturing, truth, spirituality, nothing of this material world. And though we can convince ourselves that that we are not that hungry, or we can get away with that hunger, your body would never let you get away with too much hunger because, God forbid, you'll die. We can convince ourselves that our souls can be asphyxiated and say, it's not so bad. I learned to manage. But in truth is, if you think about all the psychological maladies, illnesses, especially anxiety is essentially your soul crying out, saying, I'm desperate and hungry. That's what it comes down to. When we look for all kinds of other ways to resolve it, to relieve it, usually with things that just create more anxiety. Think about it. Whereas the real solution is to find that type of spiritual nourishment. And that comes with friendships, it comes with our relationships, it comes with everything that is not of this material world. You look in your own life and you tell me what ultimately is the deepest forms of satisfaction, and it's the things we dedicate the least time with. Anyone who's a parent that's a healthy parent will say, my children are the biggest thing for me. And yet it's the thing we spend least time with. It's just another paradox of our world, where we know in our minds it's the most valuable thing, but we have to give them security, so we got to make money, or else they're not going to be safe and secure. And all the while depriving them of security that they need because you're busy with other things. Think about it. So, can go on and on. I want to just give everyone and myself a blessing that we should be free people. Time for freedom, emancipation. We live in a free world, it's true. We're freed from many challenges, but the ones that the hardest, the final frontier is the internal ones. And that's something that only we are in control of. Nobody can free you of that. So may this be a very freeing week. And it's actually lessons that, even though I didn't spade it out, it's really lessons that we take out from this week's chapters, which is all about slavery and Exodus and freedom. But ultimately, that was the biggest trap that the Jews had in Egypt. It wasn't the physical slavery was half the story. It was the Aveda Kosha and the Ruach Tzad. They couldn't listen. They were psychologically demoralized. And until they couldn't get out of that, they could never get out of Egypt. You can get out of Egypt, but you got to get the Egypt out of you. And that was the hardest challenge. They couldn't listen even. So even as bad as the oppression was, it ultimately, it teaches us there's also an Egypt in our lives today. Mitzrayim comes from the word constraints, boundaries, limits, everything that inhibits us. So then it was an Egypt that actually enslaved the Jews in a physical sense. And today it's an Egypt that enslaves us in a psychological, emotional, spiritual sense. But the end of the story, next week's chapter, is very clear. In the bright sunlight, the essence of the day, noon, you ultimately find the freedom. That means the end of the story is a good one. But in our case, we have to initiate it, and we have to find ways to express it. I suggested different things earlier, and with that I want to bid everyone a very freeing week, and one that's sustainable, not just for 1 week, but forever. And we will continue our journey here every Wednesday night. It's been an honor and pleasure to speak to you all and share some words and share the words of hope that we are ultimately a free people. As the Maral says, that once the Jews left Egypt, they never again could be enslaved. They became fundamentally B'nai Cheren, free people. And of course he means by that mostly psychologically and spiritually. Because the fact is we were enslaved by different nations. We're still, in a way, continuing under Achashverosh or Malchus Edom or whatever you want to call Golas Edom. But psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, we never can be enslaved again. Because we are servants of one God and not servants of God's servants. Everyone have a very good week. And if you have not left your email address, please do so. We have a paper here, sign a sheet. And any way that I and Meaningful Life Center can help you become more free of your own enslaving masters, please let us know how. And until next week, thank you very much. There we go.
I have a question.
Just a second, 1 second.
The Jews of that period of the enslavement period, and the freedom they got from leaving Egypt, getting receiving the Torah, it didn't take too much longer before they became idol worshiping again. So how much freedom did they really get in the end?
It's true.
And that idol worship kept coming back and back and back.
That demonstrates what I was saying, that you can be free and still not be free. Exactly right. Well, we hope that's over with, and now we enter into the world of Mashiach, and we won't have to deal with that anymore. But we still have our challenges. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Good.